I think we all agree that we want to look for decarbonization. We really want to make it happen. However, there are certain physical constraints if it comes to really implementing renewables projects. So even if there were wishful thinking of saying, let's start close to the coastal areas where offshore wind projects can develop, they are not going to be there tomorrow, at least not at the scale we are looking at. So you have to be a little bit pragmatic again and saying, if we start with hydrogen valleys and they can start growing together and hence also start forming something like a hydrogen economy, that's the quickest solution for industrial players today.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm Hans Koenig. I lead the consulting business in the Berlin office of Aurora. And at Aurora, we of course do a lot of work on power markets, but actually one of our biggest focus areas at the moment is hydrogen. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome one of the key executives in European hydrogen on the podcast today, and that is Sopna Sury. Sopna is the Chief Operating Officer for Hydrogen at RWE Generation. And before that, she spent 10 years in roles that have spanned leading strategy and regulatory affairs at RWE Renewables, energy services and infrastructure at Uniper, and business development at E.ON Climate and Renewables. Before entering the energy sector, she completed a bank training, studied economics, and joined McKinsey, where she spent almost 10 years. And during her time at McKinsey, she also completed a PhD in economics. So that's quite a career. It's really great to have you on the show, Sopna.
Looking forward to the discussion today.
Same here. You started your career as a management consultant, but actually focused on financial services initially. What was it that brought you away from financial services and attracted you to energy?
I would say actually finance and energy is much closer than you might think because both is pretty abstract. So for me, it was actually rather the thinking, what can you realize with it? And in energy, I would always say, that's what really makes economies going. That's what really, I would say today, it definitely excites society. And that's where really you actually can influence. That's what I found really interesting. So when I was looking into what could my next career change look like, when I was changing from consulting, the energy industry definitely caught my attention. And particularly in the year when I really joined in 2011, that was really game changing. That was the year Fukushima. And suddenly, all the old rules, all the old insights, everything was suddenly invalid. We were really looking for new solutions, new approaches. And that was super exciting. So I would say energy has been always attractive and is getting even more exciting and attractive today.
Yeah, exactly. If you just look at the amount of change that's happened over the past 10 years, and then what's the pace of change is only picking up in the next 10, next 20. So yeah, it's certainly a very interesting industry to be in. As I said in the introduction, your career so far covered a lot of things: strategy, operations, business development, regulatory affairs, and other things. Which of these would you say is most important for your current role on hydrogen?
Tough question, but I would clearly say it's not a single experience. I think it's the sum of all. So, particularly today, if I think about what I need to do, what my team, what we all have to do, it's about operating in a context that is very uncertain. So anything, if I think about my strategic work previously, really helps me now because it's about strategic foresight. It's also about making judgment calls, but also having a strong analytical approach. So I would say that part, be it from my E.ON times, also my previous RWE Renewables times, definitely is very helpful. And then hydrogen, again, it's not yet a commercial case, so it's super dependent on regulatory frameworks, political support, and here again, my regulatory management experience is also helpful because you need to understand a little bit the mechanics. You need to understand how to really message. Yeah, and then I would say thirdly, at the end of the day, it's all about business development. Again, this takes a long time, and I've had quite some phases in my career where I would say my personal patience has been pretty much stretched. But I would say knowing that patience is important is also one of the important ingredients now for making hydrogen get going. Yeah.
Absolutely, it won't all happen today. RWE is pretty unusual for a utility in having a bespoke board member for hydrogen. You might even be the only one, but I'm not going to say that because I would probably get angry emails from potential other utilities that have board members for hydrogen. But so let's keep it to RWE. Why does RWE need a separate board member for hydrogen?
See, I would say we as a group, we definitely take the topic of hydrogen very, very seriously. Because for us, it's definitely a building block in the energy transition. And as a building block, you also have to be serious about how serious and senior management attention you want to put into that one. So this is for me the main reason why we said if you want to do it, we want to do it properly. And I would even go so far to saying you need to put a right weight at board level. And maybe 10 years down the road, Hans, who knows? But 10 years down the road, I would think many might ask themselves as companies why they didn't take the step earlier. So we'd rather be seen as somebody who has been leading the pack.
Yeah. Okay. I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, interestingly, you're part of RWE Generation, which, for those who don't know RWE very well, is the part of the company that contains the dispatchable power generation, such as CCGTs and so on. Given RWE's commitment to green hydrogen in particular, would the role not actually be a better fit for RWE Renewables, where you develop the onshore and offshore wind parks, solar, and so forth?
You might think so, but I think it's important to note again, I mean, hydrogen is not only built on a single capability. So the way and approach we are taking as RWE is definitely to looking across the hydrogen value chain. And here I think also important to note that we are the only company in Germany who's even actively engaged on all the steps of the hydrogen value chain. So green power, renewables power is definitely, let me call it a crucial input factor, but at the same time, looking at our renewables colleagues, I mean, they already have a super ambitious growth program that they are delivering on. At the same time, renewables is an established business model, yeah, with a very strong international track record. Whilst hydrogen, I mean, the business model still has to be created, and this truly requires focus and full energy. So now you could say, okay, great, understand, but why is it then really on the generation side? And here, I mean, also to be very clear, I mean, we are covering also key capabilities because we are the ones who want to operate the electrolyzers. Hence, with our long-standing gas experience, I mean, that's an equally important capability we bring to the table. And we see ourselves hence as the platform and hub within RWE, where I, with my team, do bring together all the different colleagues, yeah, across trading, industrial relationships, operations, engineering to really, I would say, deliver the best of RWE to the market.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you. I'd like to turn it to the role of hydrogen in the energy transition at large now and start with a fairly broad one. Why is it that everyone is getting excited about hydrogen? Because in a way, people have been talking about the hydrogen economy for 30 years or more, but it has never taken off. What is different now?
I would say on the one hand, the renewables production cost, the so-called levelized cost of electricity, I mean, they have come down tremendously over the past 10 or 15 years. Second important change that we can perceive is that society, you can call it zeitgeist. I mean, they have really matured. So we are all embracing now decarbonization and are really looking for delivering on clean energy. So now with increasing renewables penetration, there's also the element of increasing requirement on energy storage, such as hydrogen. And so I would also say this brings us again into the extraordinary starting position that we have the portfolio and we have the value chain. And that's, I think, lots of reason to being excited. So we can really start bridging from the past to the future.
Okay, so it's a combination of technology, societal consensus, and ambition, perhaps that is now that now make it happen. So, of course, I think everyone agrees now that hydrogen will play a very important role in decarbonizing a lot of activities. Fairly uncontroversial, I would say, are steelmaking, several applications in the chemical industry, aviation, shipping. I'd like to turn our conversation to some of the more controversial areas, which where there might be a bit more disagreement whether hydrogen should or should not play a role. And the first I'd like to bring up is long-distance road transport, because I noticed a certain shift. A few years ago, this was clearly the territory of hydrogen or e-fuels, but increasingly truck manufacturers are moving towards electrification. Building a couple of days ago, there was an announcement of a couple of big ones collaborating to build their own charging network for electric trucks. What's your take? Will hydrogen play a role there?
In mobility, I would say there's not a single bullet for decarbonization. But I truly believe there are two aspects that do matter. The one is the topic about trip distance, and the other one is about payload. So definitely e-mobility is going to be a clear winner if you think about personal type of mobility, or if distances are rather short and payload is small. But if you think about distances, maybe something like 500 kilometers and more, then of course heavy duty transport will definitely rely on hydrogen to come. I think, however, if you look at some of those conversations, sometimes I keep on wondering why it is so ideologically loaded. I think it's still open how the race is going to be moving, but I think if you think about the potential use cases, especially in the mobility sector, I would say you definitely need infrastructure in either case. Whether it's going to be infrastructure for the more private vehicles, or it's going to be hydrogen fueling stations. So the way I would look at the economy and the use cases is that I would see maybe as the first step private hubs to evolve, and then maybe something like transport corridors where you can definitely deploy hydrogen because it makes sense. You have same corridors where trucks are moving back and forth, and hence you can also have certain efficiency gains with the respective infrastructure which is associated.
Okay, so we'll see electrification everywhere for passenger transportation, obviously, but also for short distance trucking, but along more long distance corridors, the motorways, we will need a hydrogen infrastructure. Is your take?
Yeah, definitely. And as you say, it's the infrastructure which is going to be a key enabler. And I would also use, because you mentioned the truck manufacturers, I mean, the jury is still out. You definitely need to have a much higher truck availability because without those trucks, there's no one who's going to actually invest, yeah, in terms of new fleets of
Yeah.
trucks coming up. So it's those two elements.
Yeah, very good point. Heating is the other very big controversy, potentially even more controversial than long distance transportation, because there you have especially the operators of gas distribution grids fear obsolescence and losing ground to heat pumps. Of course, as RWE, you could produce green electricity to supply heat pumps or to supply electrolyzers that then supply boilers. So in a way, you could be agnostic here. What are you agnostic, or what do you think will win the game there?
Here I would perfectly say we are definitely agnostic. I mean, surely we are going to see a hybrid approach because it also very much depends on the customer's preferences, doesn't it? And as you said, I mean, we are ready to supply green power, we are ready to supply the hydrogen as required. But I think it always comes down to the respective market, what type of infrastructure is already there, and also about not only infrastructure in terms of what you have to bring to the homes of the people, of the retail customers, but also from a market perspective. Because if you wanted to use really heat pumps and hence electrification, you also need to be ready to transmit the power long distance. So there is also a challenge about how expensive is it and how quickly can you really implement. So, and from this point of view, you could also argue it might be even better to use hydrogen. But this again is another question about maybe public acceptance also by the retail customers. Do they really feel comfortable with actually having a new type of gas in their homes? So, long story short, I would definitely say it's going to be a hybrid approach, and we are anyways ready. But maybe just one more element to add. I think we need to be also very clear. There has to be a certain pragmatism. And particularly if I think about the UK, whatever way we are going to go, we'll need to have the right regulatory framework in place. We need to have the right infrastructure in place. And this is then going to evolve over time.
I think you're absolutely right. I think the challenge really especially in the heating space is that we need to give a clear guidance which infrastructure will be in place in 2050 for people to make their decisions. So will you have access to a gas distribution grid, which will then run on green methane or hydrogen or something like that? Or will that not be around in your area, which means that you, over the next 10, 20 years, you probably shouldn't invest in a new gas boiler, but rather invest in a heat pump. I think these kind of decisions people will need guidance on, and probably the only people who can give guidance on this is politicians, would be my take. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, I would definitely agree, Hans, because in fact, I mean, you would always say you need to be informed as a customer and need to understand what your choices are. But then I'm personally also very much convinced people should have choices. Yes, and politicians can guide, but eventually I think everybody is going to be fairly cost sensitive. So it's also about the question not only providing guidance as a politician, but also the right framework and incentives being in place to make it as easy as possible for the retail customer to choose.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another fairly large disagreement in the industry and even among experts is where the electrolyzers will be located. Either, and kind of the two schools of thought are with demand. So you transport the electricity, for instance, to a factory site and make the hydrogen on site, or alternatively with the renewable supply, potentially even offshore, and then transporting the hydrogen through the gas network. Which form do you think will be dominant? Of course, that also has implications for infrastructure, whether and which gas grids we need, and so forth.
See, all these forms will have their advantages, right? I mean, it always depends on what the customer needs. And I think it's also a debate about what is there in terms of existing infrastructure, what conditions does a current brownfield site really offer. That's why the way we've been also approaching projects is to rather say we want to drive different dimensions and different aspects. And I would say in the short to midterm, personally, I think there is a big opportunity for leveraging existing infrastructure and also existing supply chains with current industrial sites. So, what we do see happening is that you rather see hydrogen valleys, hydrogen clusters through integrated projects evolving, bringing the electrolysis to the industrial site, meaning that you also have to transport the electricity. But as you pointed out, I mean, in the longer term, and if you think about what is really, I would say, industrialized, large scale possibility for electrolysis, I think indeed it is more rational to saying, let's use offshore wind, particularly in areas like Germany or in Europe. And then you can also demonstrate large scale with potentially then industrial players rather moving towards where the actual source is. And then you would also logically go into saying, okay, then it's not anymore for transporting the electrons, but it's rather for transporting then the molecules in a very short distance, or actually, if you have to transport them within the market, even to further sites.
Okay, so it's not either or, but it's first the one, then the other. First, we create the clusters and the local production, and then later, as we really scale it up, we make this with the renewables generation and transport it to the clusters we created in the first place.
Absolutely. And I think it's also a check of reality, to be very honest, because I think we all agree that we want to look for decarbonization. We really want to make it happen. However, there are certain physical constraints if it comes to really implementing renewables projects. So even if there were wishful thinking of saying, let's start close to the coastal areas where offshore wind projects can develop, they are not going to be there tomorrow, at least not at the scale we are looking at. So you have to be a little bit pragmatic again and saying, if we start with hydrogen valleys, and they can start growing together and hence also start forming something like a hydrogen economy, that's the quickest solution for industrial players today.
Yeah. I mean, and this ties into, so one of the really big questions I'm currently grappling with is how hard we should try to defend some of the very energy intensive industries in Germany, but Europe as a whole. Because one could argue that steelmaking only ever took place in the rural area because we had coal and we had iron nearby. And soon we will be importing hydrogen and iron to produce steel in Germany. So I think there will be a lot of economic pressure to move these activities either to where the energy is cheap, or where the clean energy and the hydrogen is cheap, or where the iron comes from, and they might even coincide. How strongly do you think should we try to oppose this pressure to keep the heavy industry in Europe and in Germany?
Not sure it's about really opposing a certain pressure. I think I would rather turn it more positively. I think it's a really big opportunity we in Europe have to keep heavy industrialized processes and also associated jobs. And it's an opportunity for the political arena to also help setting the right, I would say, regulatory frameworks in place today. Because obviously, I mean, and you talked about it. I mean, the steel industry, they are under heavy pressure themselves. It's anyways a very competitive industry they're in. Yes, we do have also steel being largely a commodity, with other markets, I would say, kind of swamping the market partly globally. So, what can they really do? If they really get the support and the incentive to saying, look, I can stay here and I can make investment decisions today to really change from a conventional production route to more decarbonized processes like DRI, like direct reduction of iron ore, then I think there is a certain opportunity for doing both decarbonizing, creating jobs, and keeping jobs at the same time. And I would say also to your argument, because you mentioned, wouldn't it be more economic to actually move towards where the hydrogen can be produced much cheaply? I mean, I would say I would fully agree. Of course, green power and hence also green hydrogen is one of the massive input factors, but it's not the only decision factor. You can
Yeah.
talk about existing infrastructure, about existing supply chains, about the availability of skilled labor, and also, last but not least, the stability of the political environment. And all these elements together, I'm not so sure they can be transferred that easily.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And I mean, this takes us to what's going to happen in Germany this fall, because we'll have parliamentary elections and potentially a bit of an upset in political stability. We'll see. What is clear is that the new government will have a huge amount of work to do to get the country on a trajectory to meet both its 2030 climate targets, which have been made stricter recently, as well as the new 2045 net zero target, which the outgoing government has announced. In terms of achieving this, what's on top of your wish list for the new government?
I would say I would start with that all of us, we have to move faster, and we have to move faster from planning to acting. Yeah. So concretely, I mean, we kind of touched upon the long lead times and how long it takes for really delivering renewables projects already, be it in Germany or in Europe in general. But I think particularly in Germany, it takes a long time, yeah, from really, I would say, starting construction works until you can really begin. So what is it about the permitting process, the approval procedures? So here, I think it's all about speed, where again, from a political aspect, there are a lot of things that can be helpfully put in place to have again the right context to make these things happen much faster. Um, and second, I would say the one is the permitting approval procedure. The next one is if you think about hydrogen economy and what we want to achieve, we need to also make sure that the renewables build out targets are reflecting these ambitions. And this is not yet the case. So I would say the next government would be well counseled in putting more emphasis on that topic and being very clear that that ambition really matches what we want to achieve with hydrogen as well. And then you can even go further and say, okay, great, then we would have maybe larger targets, but how do we really get there in terms of delivery? And then we talk about, I would say, space. At least in Germany, I mean, we are a country where we don't have as much space as other markets globally. Yeah, if I compared, for instance, with the US or with Australia. Hence, we're also very much looking towards making sure we can use offshore wind as one technology. And there is a possibility. There's again the opportunity for making sure we really get the right areas, the right offshore sea areas ready for hydrogen production. Or maybe even combine offshore wind with hydrogen projects. So those are all different instruments and elements where I would be very happy to see the next government really acting.
Yes, I mean, certainly a lot of work cut out for the new government, and I think the need for speed is very clear, and I mean, also looking at other markets that are struggling with permitting regimes. So I think the problem is that the devil is so much in the details. So and it's lots of small rules that need to be changed to speed things up. But yeah, if we don't manage that, I think we can. It's pretty clear that we can scrap at least 2030, if not also 2045. I'd like to turn it to RWE's strategy in the hydrogen space next. And obviously, this is an area that's getting pretty crowded with oil and gas majors, with utilities, with renewables developers, and also gas infrastructure companies all seeking to play a role. Where do you see your role, and where do you see your edge in this increasingly crowded market?
I would say, first of all, we are definitely in a strong position, to play a key role in generating green hydrogen on an industrial scale. So I'm not talking small projects, I'm not talking distributed energies, I'm really talking large industrial scale. We are, as it stands as RWE, also the only German company who's really involved in all stages of the green hydrogen value chain. So everything from green power generation over to the production of the green hydrogen, and also, I would say, combining it with storage opportunities and close relationships to customers. And I think that's also one element if you talk about where does RWE really play a role. um, I would really see ourselves being the partner to the industry. So we can really help the industry decarbonize. And I would also turn around the points you made about, okay, it's a crowded space. Yeah, it is crowded, but you also need many, many capabilities. It's not about one company. Yeah, it's not even about RWE on our own delivering. That's not going to work. We need the gas network transport companies. We need the off-takers, hence the industrial players. We really need also the suppliers, to really make a story come to reality. So I would say we are very clear. We have a lot of strength in our own house that we can deliver on across the value chain. But I think equally the capability of building partnerships and hence enabling an economy to evolve. That's our big strength here.
Hmm. And I think, in a way, this kind of partnership approach, it very much is also expressed in some of the early hydrogen projects which you are pushing or which you are part of. So as I read recently, 3 of your projects have made it through the first selection round in what is called the Important Project of Common European Interest (IPCEI) tender. Which is basically the main support mechanism for hydrogen projects at the moment. Could you explain to our listeners what these projects are about and what role RWE plays within them? Because all of them are partnerships, actually.
Yeah, sure. And indeed, as you said, the IPCEI program is definitely a very strong instrument. And I would say also very important ones, particularly in a European context, because it definitely facilitates the topic about or resolving the issue of state aid at a very early stage so that projects really understand on which level playing field they are working on. So let me talk a little bit about the projects. Yes, indeed. Let me start with Get H2. So in Get H2, it's about a 100 megawatt electrolysis plant. We're aiming for a COD, so commissioning date by 2024. And then it's going to be the largest of its kind in Germany. Are we doing this alone? No, we don't, right? We are in together with many different partners, and we plan to expand the capacity in a beautiful city called Lingen, that's in Lower Saxony in Germany, to 300 megawatts by 2026. And I think there it's very important to understand once we go to that big capacity, that's when in this project we can really bring together the hydrogen storage possibility in EPA, so using salt caverns. And this is going to really add a lot of flexibility here to actually make this project come reality. Second, we also have then the chance of really connecting towards different centers and off-takers in Germany, specifically in the rural area, because we have the pipeline connections. And those are not going into the rural area. This is really about working cross-collaboratively Europe-wide, because we have also the possibility to connect into the Netherlands, to France, to Belgium. And I think this really makes a story, and this really also demonstrates why Get H2, from an IPCEI perspective, is a European project and can really serve as one of the nucleus for evolving into a hydrogen economy. But I would say, whilst I would call Get H2 a very typical project, let me also shed some light on another one. So we are also pursuing a project family called Aquaventus. And here I think we are much more breaking new technology ground. The reason is because we are working on a concept here for offshore generation of hydrogen based on offshore wind, and really combining the offshore wind power with the electrolysis plant gives us a possibility of scaling up to 10 gigawatts by 2035. Heligoland is serving here as one of the nucleus because around that island we already have quite some operations, thankfully as RWE, but it also serves, I think, as a very nice blueprint how to, again, I would say, deliver on the industrial scale. And by the way, maybe just as a side note, because you mentioned 3 projects, in fact, in Aquaventus, as the family, we also have 2 sub-projects, Aqua Primus 2 and Aquaductus, both of which have been nominated for the IPCEI. Yeah, and thirdly, maybe just to complete the IPCEI families, we are also engaged in participating in the high-tech harbor Rostock, which is about 100 megawatt. And here the difference again is, I mean, it's a very, I would say, strong local commitment we are really entering into because the local region, the Rostock Seaport, has been really driving this project. So it's also about really understanding what you can give back to the region. And ultimately, we're looking at producing green ammonia. So here, it's not only about hydrogen, but it's also different type of carrier that can be then used in the respective industry. And here, potential will be, let me think, up to 1 gigawatt, yeah, that can be created on site.
I mean, really impressive projects. I mean, in terms of their configuration, but especially also in terms of their scale, because I think it's pretty clear that that hydrogen needs to it doesn't just need pilots, but needs to get big pretty quickly, and that's what you seem to be doing here. Maybe briefly on the ammonia one, do you see a future for local production of ammonia in Germany? Because at the same time, ammonia is also expected to be one of the main transport vectors of hydrogen internationally. So if we're using ammonia to import green hydrogen from Saudi Arabia or somewhere, will we really be also making it locally in the longer term, or is this more about demonstrating the technology, demonstrating that it can be done, even though it may not be done in the long term in Germany?
See, I mean, there's definitely a big demonstration element into it because at the end, I mean, on the one hand, I think we need to also prove in Germany, but also in Europe that we are capable, that we have the technology experience. And if I'm saying we, I'm not saying RWE. What I mean with we is the technology providers, the suppliers, also of the electrolysis plants, and also of the, let me call it, subsequent processes to really then, I would say, produce the green ammonia. At the same time, you're perfectly right, Hans. I mean, in the longer term, of course, I mean, we'll be highly dependent on imports, whether they do come from Saudi Arabia, from the MENA region, or maybe much closer, somewhere from Southern Europe. So, and I think that's again where the debate is out, and we are also looking at it. What is going to be the smartest hydrogen carrier? Is it going to be ammonia, which is then going to be imported to Germany and Europe, or is it going to be whatever, some kind of differently liquefied hydrogen? And hence, I think that's where we still have to see and understand how this is going to evolve. There's no clear answer yet today.
The jury's still out. Okay, yeah, makes sense. Another interesting contrast is your activities in the IPCEI tenders, where you are yourself involved in making the hydrogen. With a recent announcement which RWE made with BASF, the major chemical company, whom you're planning to supply with the output of a 2 gigawatt yet to be built subsidy-free offshore wind park in the North Sea, for them to, and they would then take this power to produce, amongst other things, hydrogen in their Ludwigshafen plant. And in this case, it's at least in terms of what's publicly available, it looks like as if you won't be operating the electrolyzer. So should we think about RWE as sometimes the supplier of green power, sometimes the electrolyzer, sometimes both, like whatever is needed in a project?
I would say it always depends what the setup is, and it always depends what the customer's need or partner's need looks like. So, of course, the first aim is to maximize what we can bring to the table in terms of strength. And here, definitely the green power production and the green hydrogen production are very important. If you talk specifically about the BASF project, the way I would look at it, the primary objective here is really to demonstrate that we can help decarbonize, that we can really help decarbonize one of the biggest emitters, that we can help decarbonize an industry that is not so trivial. And hence, if we can support and help by producing a green power that we then actually provide to BASF, and at the same time use part of the power, in this case 20%, to produce green hydrogen via electrolysis on our own sites, that still actually makes the equation even up, right? Because it's still about hydrogen. It's just a different, let me call it, element how we look at it. And at the end of the day, I think, coming back to my topic about speed, the faster the better, yeah? So it's less about ideology. It's just making sure it's going to work.
Yeah, very, very important. And this brings me actually pretty neatly to the final part about the role of hydrogen, because in my impression, quite little of the conversation so far, or the public debate so far, is about hydrogen in the power sector. There's a lot of talk about industry. There's a lot of talk about transport and heating. But of course, ultimately, once we fully decarbonize the power sector, something is going to have to balance the system when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. And hydrogen looks like a very promising contender there. So, do you have any plans of converting your existing CCGTs to run on hydrogen? If so, in which time frame? Or do you rather think it's going to be other technologies like fuel cells and so forth who will take over the hydrogen role in the power sector?
I mean, let me first refer back to what you just said earlier in terms of that there's little speak yet out there about using hydrogen in the power sector. I mean, I think the obvious reason is because you have massive losses, right, in terms of energy conversion. So from a use case perspective, it's not the immediate use case.
Yeah.
But is it not an important use case? No, of course it is super important. So from a timing perspective, I would say by the 2030s, after the 2030s, mid 2030s, we'll definitely look, and also we as RWE are looking at our decarbonization path for the existing gas generation fleet. And here, again, it's all about potential solutions. So we are, of course, equally investigating whether then switching the fuel from natural gas to hydrogen is an option, whether potentially, depending on the market where you are, also CCS, so carbon capture storage, and CO2 shipping might be options. And I think that always depends a little bit on also the regulatory situation in all the markets, but also on the geographical conditions we can see. And of course, also infrastructure. But I would also totally agree. I mean, the one is, I don't think there's an option, right? I mean, we are serious and we want as a company also to become carbon neutral by 2040. So it's very clear we are going to decarbonize our own gas-fired fleet. It's more the question, I would say, if I now look from a market perspective, what is now also going to happen with the new build that I think without any question is going to be required, especially in Germany, because of all the renewables penetration increasing. And I think there again, now it's getting really interesting and exciting again, because this is a question where, again, political frameworks can help, because there needs to be incentive for building new firm flex capacity. And at the same time, we all have to think about how to inherently already decarbonize so that we don't lock in ourselves. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think in a lot of conversations we're having in Germany, but also in Poland, for instance, there's a big question mark over new gas investments because you have to very credibly show that you can make them net zero ready. Otherwise, you won't get financing and so forth. So it's the pressure, even though they will only be converted at a later stage, the pressure to show this and to have a plan for net zero in the power sector is already very clear in the flexible investments that are being made today.
And I mean, just let me add here, Hans. And I think that's also, again, where I think the notion about acting comes into play, because we as a company, we are already today very much exploring early development pilot projects in order to be either hydrogen ready or looking into different solutions. And I think that's the point, right? We need to think about concrete solutions. And if you don't start those pilots today, then it's going to be a little bit too late in a few years' time.
Absolutely, yes. Great, thank you very much for your comments. Before we come to the end of the podcast, I'd like to put a couple of concepts in the energy transition to you and get your view on whether they are overrated or underrated in your view. And the ideal answer to these concepts, or to the question whether they're overrated or underrated, might be a word, or might be a sentence, or at most two. But we're really going for the short answer and for the slight oversimplification rather than the nuanced answer here, if that works for you. And the first
I'll
concept.
try my best.
Excellent. The first concept I'd like to put to you is carbon pricing as a means to achieve decarbonization.
Ooh, underrated. So I would say CO2 is definitely a key means to drive carbonization, but that's going to take too long, to really produce relevant signals for the industries to change. And that's why we need also some kind of regulatory supporting measures here.
Okay. E-fuels, overrated or underrated?
Clearly underrated. So I would say in a long-term perspective, it's really one of the required necessary conditions, especially for the aviation industry. So I would say also underrated because we need to start balancing already today certain developments, although it's a rather long-term perspective, until it gets economically into play.
Okay. Blue hydrogen as a transition fuel.
Oh, that's a tricky one. So I would say blue hydrogen as such, clearly overrated, but blue hydrogen as a transition fuel is underrated.
Okay.
If you allow me this kind of, I would say, dichotomy here. And the reason I'm just saying is, the only long-term fossil-free hydrogen option is still the green one, right? But again, pragmatically, and we talked about it earlier, since the industry has to take decisions today, and we definitely all want to avoid lock-in effects, let's be again pragmatic. And if in a transitory time period, blue hydrogen can play a role and be part of the solution space, great.
Okay. Fourthly, hydrogen imports from the MENA region as opposed to locally produced hydrogen here in Europe.
Overrated. So Europe will definitely require imports. There is no doubt. And there's also no doubt because homegrown hydrogen is not going to be sufficient. However, I would always say it also takes time to establish shipping import routes, also from the MENA region. So I think we'd be all smart enough to, I would say, also consider alternative sourcing areas, like for instance in Southern Europe, where I would then anticipate it's much faster. And I would say in terms of production costs, also equally cheap.
Yeah. And then finally, breakthrough technologies as opposed to gradual improvements of existing technology.
Overrated. So I would say technology ingredients are there today already. So we do have the electrolyzers, and electrolysis as such is a well-established chemical process. So I would rather turn it around and say there's a litmus test open because it's not yet clear which of those technologies, be it alkaline-based or proton exchange membrane or high temperature electrolysis, is going to really deliver on the anticipated cost reductions. But nevertheless, it's more, I would say, a continuous improvement. And then if you think about breakthrough technologies, I think you'd rather see smart combinations. Yeah. So you can kind of combine technologies like an offshore wind, also, I would say, producing hydrogen, maybe in the turbine, maybe in a platform, maybe in a foundation, which I would also then see maybe as a bit more forward looking, but it's not really completely putting everything upside down.
Okay, makes sense. So fusion energy won't play a big role. Great. This brings us to the end of the conversation. Thank you very much for your insights, Sopna. It's been a real pleasure. And hopefully talk to you soon.
It's been great, Hans. Thank you so much for the invitation.
That was Hans Koenig, who leads the consulting business at the Berlin office of Aurora, speaking to Sopna Sury, Chief Operating Officer for Hydrogen at RWE Generation. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening and goodbye.